The courtroom was a quiet, sterile space filled with the sound of a clock ticking against the murmur of soft conversations. Lisa Thompson stood at the edge of the room, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She had always hated the idea of being in a courtroom. It wasn't just the intimidating atmosphere, it was the feeling of being judged, of knowing that whatever happened next was out of her control. But today was different. Today, she stood accused of something simple: running a red light. It seemed like a minor offense to most, but to Lisa, it felt like the universe had stacked the odds against her. She had been driving to pick up her daughter from school when the incident occurred. It wasn't that she didn't see the light turning red, but she was running late, and the thought of her daughter waiting in the cold made her make a quick decision. As she entered the courtroom, she tried to steady her breath. The judge, Henry Carter, sat elevated on the bench, a man of years of experience, his gray hair neatly combed back. His sharp eyes scanned the room as he looked down at the people before him. Known for being strict, his reputation was one of precision and a no-nonsense approach to the law. Lisa had heard stories about him. He was the type who didn't show mercy, even for minor infractions. A person's story didn't matter to him, only the law did. Next case, the court clerk called, snapping Lisa out of her thoughts. She slowly walked up to the front, keeping her eyes on the judge's stern expression. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her palms sweating in her jacket pockets. She was used to tough situations, but this felt different. It felt like the world was watching, waiting for her to slip. "State your name for the record." Judge Carter's voice rang out, cold and firm. "Lisa Thompson," she said, her voice shaking only slightly as she stepped forward. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses, peering down at her as he reviewed the paperwork before him. His eyes briefly met hers, but Lisa could not read his expression. She felt as though he was sizing her up, examining more than just her case. "Miss Thompson, you were cited for running a red light last week. Do you acknowledge the offense?" Lisa swallowed. The reality of the moment settled in her chest. She nodded, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, Your Honor, I acknowledge the violation," she said quietly. She couldn't bring herself to say more. She didn't have an excuse, and she wasn't sure she wanted to explain the rushed decisions of her day. "Very well," Judge Carter said, making a note on his paper. "Given the circumstances, I will impose a fine of $300. Please pay the fine within the next 30 days, or further action will be taken." Lisa's stomach tightened at the mention of the fine. $300. It might as well have been $1 million. She barely made enough to cover her rent and buy groceries, but she nodded, unable to argue. What could she say? The law was the law. The judge wasn't going to show any mercy. As she left the courtroom, her mind raced with frustration. She had never expected that a simple moment of bad luck would lead her to this. But as the doors swung open, she had no idea that the weight of this courtroom moment would soon be overshadowed by a revelation that would turn her world upside down. Lisa walked out of the courthouse, feeling the weight of the fine pressing down on her chest. As the doors swung closed behind her, she felt a wave of frustration flood over her. She had been hoping for leniency, perhaps a warning, but Judge Carter had delivered the harshest of outcomes. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. Lisa had always felt like the world had a way of putting her down, and now it seemed like yet another example of life being unfair. She made her way to her car, her mind spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole ordeal had felt off. The judge, with his stern face and sharp voice, had seemed almost too familiar. The way he looked at her, the small crease on his forehead when he studied her case, there was something about his eyes, a familiarity that she couldn't place. But it was more than just the cold authority of the man on the bench. Something deeper gnawed at her, like a lingering question that refused to be answered. As she drove home, the familiar streets of the small town outside the courthouse blurred by the rush of her thoughts, Lisa kept coming back to that same unsettling feeling. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt like there was a connection between her and Judge Carter, something she couldn't explain. Maybe it was just nerves or the shock of the fine, but she had to admit that something about the encounter had struck her on a deeper level. Later that evening, Lisa called her mother, Naomi, to vent. She sat on the couch, rubbing her eyes as she spoke into the phone. Naomi was a steady presence in Lisa's life, the one person who always seemed to know how to calm her down. But this time, Lisa needed to talk about the judge, the fine, and the strange, nagging feeling she had. "Mom, you won't believe what happened today," Lisa began, her voice tinged with frustration. "I was in court for that stupid red light ticket, and Judge Carter was so cold. He didn't even listen to me, just fined me like I was some kind of criminal." Lisa paused, then added, "You know, there was something about him. I don't know what it was, but he looked at me like he knew me. It was weird, like there was some kind of connection." Naomi went silent on the other end of the line. Lisa, caught up in her emotions, didn't notice the pause. When Naomi finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost distant. "I don't know what to tell you, honey," Naomi said, her words careful. "But you might want to think about that judge. There are things you don't know. Things that might come up one day." Lisa frowned, a knot forming in her stomach. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Naomi's voice grew quieter. "It's not my place to explain everything, but just be careful. Things aren't always as they seem." Lisa was left with more questions than answers. She couldn't understand why her mother was being so cryptic, but deep down, she felt the tension in Naomi's words. Something was happening that Lisa couldn't yet see, but the feeling that there was more to this judge than met the eye began to grow stronger. Little did she know, the answers she sought were closer than she could ever have imagined. Later that evening, Judge Henry Carter sat alone in his study, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating his face as he reviewed case files. But his mind wasn't on the paperwork in front of him. It was on Lisa Thompson. Her face, her eyes, had been on his mind all day. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen her before. When she had stepped into the courtroom earlier, something about her had struck him as familiar. He dismissed it at first. Surely it was just his imagination. But as the day went on, the unsettling sensation only grew stronger. As a judge, Henry was used to controlling his emotions. He had seen all kinds of cases and heard every type of story. But this was different. There was a strange pull, an undeniable connection that he couldn't explain. He found himself retracing the moments of the hearing, studying her face again in his memory. Her expression had been one of quiet resignation, almost like she was expecting the fine. But it wasn't just that. There was something else. He had seen a reflection of someone in her, someone familiar. His thoughts drifted back to a time long past, a life he hadn't thought about in years. Naomi Carter. Her name echoed in his mind like a distant memory he tried to bury. He remembered her laugh, the way she had smiled at him during their brief time together. It had been a summer romance that had ended before it had even begun. There had been too many complications, too many obstacles. Naomi had disappeared from his life, and he had moved on. At least, that's what he had told himself. But now, with Lisa's face in his mind, a disturbing realization crept in. Could it be? No, he told himself, it couldn't. Yet he couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that Lisa might be his daughter. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. But how could he have never known? Why hadn't he ever suspected? His heart began to race as the weight of the possibility pressed down on him. He sat there, paralyzed by the thought of it. If Lisa was truly his daughter, what did that mean for him? What did that mean for her? He had spent so many years building a reputation as a fair and impartial judge, but could he have overlooked something as important as this in his own life? His hand shook slightly as he grabbed the phone and dialed the courthouse records office. He couldn't just sit here and wonder anymore. He needed answers. He needed to know who Lisa Thompson really was. And deep down, he knew he needed to face the truth of what had happened all those years ago. The next morning, Judge Carter could barely focus. The nagging thought that Lisa Thompson might be his daughter refused to leave his mind. He sat at his desk, surrounded by case files, but the papers blurred in front of him. His thoughts kept drifting back to Naomi, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had lost touch with after their brief relationship many years ago. Could it really be true? Could Lisa be the child of that lost summer? The idea seemed too unbelievable, yet something inside him told him to investigate further. The thought of confronting Naomi about this, after all these years, felt like stepping into unknown territory. But there was no way around it. He had to know the truth. He took a deep breath and picked up the phone, dialing the courthouse records office. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the receiver to his ear. When the clerk answered, he asked for a copy of Lisa Thompson's file. "I need the details of a case from yesterday," he said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "It's for personal reasons. Please send it to my office as soon as possible." A few minutes later, the file arrived, and Henry quickly opened it. His eyes scanned the page, skimming over the basic information: name, address, and details of the violation. But then his gaze froze on the section that listed family members. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it. The name of Lisa's mother, Naomi Carter. He stared at the name for several seconds, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. Naomi. The same Naomi who had once been in his life. His fingers shook as he turned the page, hoping he was mistaken. But as he read further, the reality of the situation began to sink in. There it was listed clearly. Naomi Carter had raised Lisa as a single mother. His breath caught in his throat. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with startling clarity. Lisa Thompson, the woman he had fined for running a red light, was his daughter. The same daughter he had never known. The same daughter whose existence he had never been told about. Henry's mind raced as he sat there in stunned silence. How had he missed this? Why had Naomi kept this secret from him all these years? Did she think he wouldn't care? Or was it something deeper, something more complicated than he could ever have imagined? He knew he needed to speak to Naomi, to confront her with what he had just learned. But the question swirled in his mind. What would he say to her? How could he possibly explain that after all these years, he had discovered that he was the father of a woman he had fined in court? The weight of the revelation hit him hard. He had just made a mistake that could never be undone. The truth was finally clear, but it had come at a cost, one he wasn't sure how to pay. The realization that Lisa Thompson was his daughter weighed heavily on Judge Carter. He could no longer sit in the confines of his office, pretending to focus on the day's work. The walls seemed to close in around him as he replayed the events of the past day. His mind was clouded with a mixture of guilt, regret, and confusion. The truth had come to him like a sudden storm, and now there was no escaping it. He had to talk to Naomi. After hours of pacing back and forth in his office, Henry finally made the decision. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers, and he needed them from the woman who had been part of his past, but whose presence had been a ghost for so many years. He picked up the phone and dialed Naomi's number, his heart racing as it rang. Each tone felt like a countdown to a conversation he wasn't sure he was ready for. When Naomi picked up, her voice was calm, almost distant, as though she already knew why he was calling. "Henry," she said softly, "I've been expecting you." The words sent a chill through him. How could she have known? He tried to steady his voice, though he was anything but steady. "Naomi, I found out something," Henry began, his words faltering. "Something that I wasn't prepared for. I found out that Lisa, she's my daughter, isn't she?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He could almost hear Naomi processing the question, deciding whether to answer it or let the silence speak for itself. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to hurt you, Henry. I never wanted this secret to come between us. When I found out I was pregnant, it felt like the right thing to do. Raising her on my own. I thought it was the best choice for both of us." Henry closed his eyes, the weight of her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. His mind flashed back to their brief time together. Their laughter, the closeness, the hope they had shared for a future that never came to pass. "You didn't think I had a right to know?" he asked, the hurt in his voice impossible to mask. Naomi's voice softened. "It wasn't that. It was complicated, Henry. After we parted ways, I didn't know how to tell you. I thought maybe it was for the best. But I always wondered what would have happened if you had been there for her. I didn't want her to grow up with the confusion of knowing you but not having you in her life." Henry's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. "So all these years, I've been walking around not knowing that I had a daughter out there. I never meant to hurt you," Naomi said again. "I never wanted this secret to come out this way." The silence that followed was heavy. Henry didn't know what to say next. His heart was full of questions, but none of them seemed to matter in the moment. He had to meet Lisa. He had to tell her who he was, even if it meant facing all the years of silence and distance between them. But how could he start a conversation that had been so long buried? The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: he couldn't undo the past. The truth had surfaced, and now the real challenge was figuring out what to do with it. Henry spent the following days in a haze. The truth had sunk in, but the reality of what it meant for his future, and for Lisa, was far more complicated than he had anticipated. He had never imagined this day would come. He had never thought about the consequences of his past decisions until now. He was a man who had dedicated his life to the law, to fairness, to judgment. Yet now his own life felt out of control. The idea of facing Lisa was terrifying. What could he possibly say? How could he explain the years of silence? He had been a judge, a man of authority, but when it came to his own daughter, he felt helpless. Lisa, meanwhile, had no idea what was about to unfold. After her conversation with her mother, Naomi had remained distant, her cryptic words lingering in Lisa's mind. She couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off, something bigger than just a speeding ticket or a simple fine. Her mother's silence and the strange hesitation had left her with more questions than answers. A few days after the court hearing, Lisa was at home, pacing the floor, trying to make sense of the pieces. She had kept thinking about Judge Carter, the way he had looked at her in court, that flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was a look she had seen before, but she couldn't quite place it. It nagged at her. She knew her mother had been hiding something, but what? That afternoon, as she sat in her small apartment staring at her phone, the weight of everything finally hit her. She couldn't stand the not knowing any longer. Her curiosity was overwhelming. And then, just as she was about to pick up the phone and dial her mother, it rang. Lisa's heart skipped a beat as she saw the name on the screen. Henry Carter. Her mind raced. Why was he calling her? She had expected him to be the last person to reach out to her again. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the answer button. Was this some form of official court business, or was there more to it? Taking a deep breath, she answered the call. "Miss Thompson." His voice was measured, calm, but there was a noticeable tension in it. "Judge Carter." Lisa replied, confusion creeping into her voice. "What's this about?" I need to speak with you," he said. His voice softened. "In person. It's important." Lisa's stomach nodded. There was something in his tone that was different from the usual authority of the courtroom. Something vulnerable. She could sense it, and for the first time since their encounter in court, she felt the sudden and undeniable pull to understand what had been left unsaid. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I need to explain something you won't believe, but I think you deserve to know," he continued, his words hanging heavily in the air. Lisa's pulse quickened. Her mind whirled. What was this? Was he about to tell her something that would change her life forever? "I'll meet you," Lisa said, her voice firm. "Where and when?" Lisa arrived at the small coffee shop on the corner of Maple and Fifth, her nerves making her every step feel like she was walking in slow motion. The meeting had been arranged quickly, too quickly, really, and she still wasn't sure what was going to happen when she sat across from Judge Henry Carter. She had felt a strange, unshakable pull to this moment, but she also had so many questions swirling in her mind. Why had he contacted her? And what was it that he needed to explain? Her mother's cryptic words kept echoing in her thoughts. Things aren't always as they seem. As she pushed open the door, she immediately spotted him at a table by the window. He looked as stern as he had in the courtroom, sitting there, his hands folded, his eyes scanning the outside world. But today, there was something different about him. His usual commanding presence seemed to be softened by a sense of vulnerability. His face was drawn with worry, and when his eyes met hers, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks, a flash of recognition, mixed with something else. Regret. "Miss Thompson," he said, standing as she approached, "I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me." She sat down, not quite knowing what to say. The air between them felt thick, like an unspoken truth hanging in the space between them. "You called me," Lisa began, her voice steady despite the rapid pace of her thoughts. "And you said you had something important to explain. What is it? What do you want from me?" Henry took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. It felt like he was weighing his words carefully, trying to find the right way to break the news. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost as if he were afraid of what he was about to say. "I know this will be difficult to believe, but I need you to hear me out," he started, his tone vulnerable yet firm. "Lisa, the truth is, I'm your father." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a blow to her chest, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. Her mind raced, unable to process the shock. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in her head. "My father," she repeated, disbelief evident in her voice. "You're telling me you're my father? The judge who fined me for running a red light?" Henry nodded, his face tightening with emotion. "Yes, I know how this sounds, but it's true. I'm the man who should have been there for you, and I wasn't. I didn't know about you until recently. But now that I do, I need you to understand what happened." Lisa was silent for a long moment, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She felt like she was suffocating under the confusion and anger swirling inside her. How could he have kept this from her? How could he have been so close to her all these years without her ever knowing? "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me the truth? I've lived my whole life thinking I didn't have a father." Henry reached across the table, his hand hovering just above hers, but he didn't touch her. "I never knew, Lisa. Your mother, Naomi, she kept this from me. I didn't know you existed until just a few days ago. And I should have come to you sooner, but the truth is, I didn't know how." Tears welled up in Lisa's eyes as she absorbed his words. The room seemed to spin around her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the years she had spent without knowing who her father was. "I don't know what to say," Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. "This is a lot to take in." Henry nodded slowly. "I understand. I can't expect you to just accept this. But I wanted you to know the truth. And if you'll let me, I'd like to get to know you, to be a part of your life, if you'll have me." The silence between them stretched on, heavy with emotion. Lisa didn't know what to say next. She wasn't sure if she was ready to forgive him, or if forgiveness was even possible. But one thing was certain. The life she had known, the identity she had built, was about to change forever. The silence between them lingered in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Lisa stared at Henry, the man sitting across from her, the man who had unknowingly walked through her life, a stranger with a familiar face. She didn't know what to feel. The shock, the confusion, the anger, all of it collided in her chest like a storm. Yet beneath the turmoil, a single question gnawed at her. How do I move forward from here? Henry could see the conflict in her eyes, the way her fingers curled into fists on the table, her body tense with emotion. He had known this moment wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected the guilt and regret to settle so deeply in his own heart. He had spent years judging others, making decisions for them. But now, for the first time, he felt completely powerless. "Lisa," he said, his voice low and sincere, "I understand if you need time to process this. I'm not asking for anything from you. I just want you to know that I'm here now. I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me." Lisa blinked, her breath shaky, as she tried to come to terms with the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She had spent years imagining what it might be like to know her father, to have him in her life. But this wasn't what she had pictured. It wasn't supposed to come with so much pain, so much history. She had imagined a reunion, but not one that started with such a heavy, painful truth. "I don't know if I can just forgive you," Lisa admitted, her voice quivering. "You've been gone all these years, and I've built my life without you. I've had to fill in the empty spaces, and now you expect me to just— what? Welcome you in?" Henry's face fell, but he didn't shy away from the harshness of her words. He knew he deserved them. "I don't expect anything, Lisa. I just want to make things right, however I can. I'm not asking you to forget the past. I can't change what's happened. But if you give me the chance, I'd like to get to know you. Slowly. No rush." For a long moment, Lisa didn't say anything. She studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all she saw was a man who was genuinely trying to make amends. Her thoughts were still a jumble, but beneath the layers of pain and confusion, she felt something stirring, a small, fragile seed of hope. It was buried deep, but it was there. "You've hurt me, Judge Carter," she finally said, using his title as a reminder of the distance between them. "But I'll think about it. I can't promise anything. Not yet." Henry nodded, understanding that this wasn't the fairy tale reunion he had hoped for. But it was a start, and that was more than he had ever dared to expect. "I'll be here, whenever you're ready." Lisa stood up, the weight of the conversation still heavy on her shoulders. "I'm not sure where we go from here," she said, her voice quieter now, but still full of uncertainty. "But thank you for telling me the truth." As she turned to leave, Henry watched her walk away, a mix of emotions flooding through him. He knew it would take time, perhaps years, for them to find their way to a new relationship. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something right. He had taken the first step, and that was all he could do. For Lisa, the road ahead was uncertain, but there was one thing she knew for sure. Her life had changed forever. And as much as it hurt, perhaps that was the first step toward healing. Sure. The story ends on a note of unresolved tension, leaving room for growth and transformation.